Sounds good. Okay. Can you see the presentation slides? All right, sounds good. So hi, I'm Kyle. I'm a fourth-year civil engineering student. Sarah and I have been working together on this research project for a few quarters, and I'm very excited to share our progress so far. Unfortunately, Sarah can't make it today, but without further ado, let's get into our research topic, peer reinforced concrete column database. This project is funded by PEER, which stands for Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center. And this project is led by Saman Abdullah, a UCLA postdoctoral researcher, and UCLA professor John Wallace. And here's the outline. I will first talk about the background and objective of our research and go into the content and organization of the database. I'll then talk about how we plan to utilize the database to evaluate ACI 318 shear strength provisions and some future tasks that we will work on. So just to be clear, this research project is still going on. It's not yet complete yet. Reinforced concrete columns are critical components of bridges and buildings because they are primarily responsible for maintaining the lateral and axial carrying capacity of a structure. And the extent of column damage plays an important role in the post-earthquake decision-making, whether a building can be repaired or have to be demolished. So it's very important to know how a reinforced concrete column behaves. Bridge piers and buildings have collapsed before in major earthquakes, such as San Fernando earthquakes in 1971, because of inadequate reinforcement details. And since then, research have been conducted on reinforced concrete columns. There were efforts in summarizing these tests in the 1990s and mid-2000s, such as the peer column database that I'm updating right now, and some other database listed on the slide. However, these databases have their limitations. They are limited to geographic regions, or they are narrowly focused in certain specimens, or they lack detailed information on the specimens. They also don't include recent tests on retrofitted columns. And therefore, our objective in this research is to update, expand, and replace the current peer column database so that it becomes a comprehensive database that addresses the limitation I mentioned it. To get to this goal, we will add parameterized data such as test setup, loading protocols, backbone curves, and computed data. We'll utilize the database to evaluate ACI 318, ASC 41, and Caltrans provisions, and develop new design provisions for reinforced concrete columns, such as stiffness, strength, primarily shear strength. That's the one we are focusing on right now, and deformation capacity. And lastly, we want to provide the community with a resource so that they can develop new provisions as well and see what they can do with the database. And now I'll talk about how the database is organized and what content we collect. So first, we collect research papers, reports, theses, and dissertations on reinforced concrete columns and organize them alphabetically based on author's last name. And what you see on the slide is a screenshot of our folders. And in each folder, it contains a report or thesis or dissertation, and then some Excel sheets on the columns backbone curves. So in each Excel sheet, there is a backbone curve. And here are the three main categories of data that we collect and computed. Specimen data, experimental data, and analytical data. So specimen data includes loading and test setup, geometry of the column, whether it is circular or rectangular, or, and the material properties and construction methods, such as the steel reinforcement properties and concrete properties, and retrofit schemes, how the columns are retrofitted, whether it is through steel or fiber, carbon fiber, sorry, and glass fiber, and combined core dimensions, longitudinal reinforcement and transverse reinforcement. And in the experimental sections, we have backbone curves and failure mode. And lastly, we have the analytical data, which is where we provide computed data, which is flexural and shear strength. And here is an example of how we collected specimen data. So what we have on the left here is a cantilever column. So in the Excel sheet, we indicated that is we indicated the test configuration with a number 1, which stands for cantilever. And we also indicate the cross-sectional shape, which is rectangular for the specimen. We also recorded the height at which the lateral load is applied, which is 1,829 millimeter for this specimen here. And using the information, we calculated the aspect ratio, which is a good indicator of how the specimens will fail. And then there are also other information not shown on the slide, but we also recorded. For example, the spacing of the transverse reinforcement in the plastic hinge region, and then how the longitudinal reinforcement are developed into the base. And for example, in this one, we have a 90-degree angle hook right here. Those are the information we also record, and we also record like the axial load and the lateral load. And here is an example of how we collected the experimental data. What you see on the slide is a typical backbone curve. And we recorded the displacement and lateral load corresponding to each important key points on a backbone curve. For example, we collected cracking, yielding, peak, ultimate, residual, and collapse. So that basically describes how what a backbone curve looks like. And we also record the failure mode of a column. What you see on the left is a column that failed in shear. As you can see, there is a diagonal shear crack, and we indicated the failure mode with a number 3, which corresponds to shear diagonal tension failure. All right. And so far, we have collected 500 specimens out of the 2,000 specimens in our folders. And Sarah and I have collected. And the graph on the left describes the year the specimens were tested. As you can see, there were a lot of tests conducted in the last 2 decades. And these tests were not recorded in the old database. And so these are valuable information that we're updating right now. And most of the tests were conducted in the United States. And out of the 500 specimens, about 100 of them are retrofitted columns. So there were a lot of efforts in investigating the performance of retrofitted columns. So you can see what research are conducted right now. And here the distribution of the cross-sectional shape, square and rectangular shapes are most frequent. And now I'm going to talk about how we are planning to use the database to evaluate the shear strength equation in ACI 318. And before we go into how we evaluate the shear strength equation, it's important to talk about why we're targeting it. We have received feedback from engineers in the industry that the shear strength equation doesn't perform well. And the shear strength equation is also outdated and have been largely unchanged since 1963. And although there is a recent update in the 2019 version to include the effect of longitudinal reinforcement and member size, these changes were done using beam tests instead of the column tests that we have. So the database, and then the database they use also didn't include the using of flexural reinforcement. And since our column database has column tests and also has specimens that fail in flexure and shear mode, we can evaluate the new provisions to see if they work well for the columns. And the first step that we plan to take is to evaluate, is to identify the correct specimens to evaluate. So we will limit the failure mode of specimens to shear and flexural shear. And we'll also limit to specimens that comply with ACI 318 codes. We will then compute the shear strength of specimens using ACI 318 provisions and compare with the actual experimental shear strength acquired from the backbone curve that I mentioned earlier. And based on the comparison, we will evaluate whether the new provisions perform well on columns. And here are the future steps that we might take based on our evaluation. We might add more data or specimens in this case to the database to improve the accuracy of our evaluation. And based on the evaluation, we might develop new design provisions for ACI 318 if it's necessary. And here I want to thank Simon for teaching Sarah and me. She's a great teacher and is always so patient and kind. And I want to thank you all for listening to the presentation, and now open up to any questions that you guys have. Thank you.
I have a question. Since this is a database, I'm guessing it's internal so far since you're like in the stages of developing the database, but like, do you guys have like any concrete plans to make it more like public, as in like peer NGA or I don't know? It looks like very, very valuable data, so.
Yeah, we're currently collecting data, so I don't think Simon planned to publish it anytime soon, but and he has done it for Shear wall before, and has developed a website interface for people to filter the data. So I believe that's the way he's going to develop it in the future, to have the database upload it to the website and then allow people to filter the database through the interface, so that people can use the database for their research.
Thanks. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Peter. Great question.
What is the stream of new test specimen data that's kind of happening worldwide that you're receiving or not receiving?
I'll say that, are you saying like what tests are people doing right now? Is that correct?
Yes, like how many annually, or just kind of like the rate of new test data that's happening currently?
Oh, I'm not too sure about that. I know there is like we have data on 2,000 specimens on the year they are produced, but I currently don't have the graph with me right now, so I can't say for sure. yeah, I'll get back to you on that.
I have a quick question. So first of all, this is a really nice presentation. I'm excited to see where this goes as you and Sarah are developing. But I would say, like, as someone who's handling a lot of data, you get a unique perspective on kind of trends. And I wanted to ask, like, were there any interesting trends that you found maybe over the years with respect to the concrete columns, maybe because you're looking not only at the characteristics of each specimen, but also like failure modes, right? Was there anything that you observed that might be insightful at this stage, or do you think you need a little bit more time to really, like, parse out the data and kind of analyze the trends?
We'll still need to look into the data to see, to fully get an idea of the data. But I have observed that throughout the year, research have moved from like the performance of columns in the plastic hinge region to now developing retrofit schemes to make this column stronger. And I still haven't looked at enough recent specimen tests to see what researchers are doing right now. So I'll keep you posted on that later.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Oh, if there is no more questions, we'll move on to the next presenter. And thank you everyone for the great questions. I'll stop share so that you guys can share.
All right, let me just take a second to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? All right. Okay, awesome. So I guess I'll just get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trisha, and I'm a first year here at UCLA. So over the past few months, I developed a web application to complement a research project conducted by PhD candidate Munira Al-Adsani from the Burton Research Group, which developed an explainable machine learning model for predicting the drift capacity of reinforced concrete structural walls. So today I'd like to start off by just introducing the research and giving a little bit of background about the motivation behind conducting it. And then afterwards, I'd like to talk about what web applications are, their utility, and then the development process for the web application I created. And then finally, I'd just like to walk through the web application itself to really demonstrate its functionalities and how powerful it is as a tool, both computationally and for organizing information in a way that's more easy to understand and digestible. So to start off, the drift capacity of structural walls is often defined as the drift or lateral displacement corresponding to 20% lateral strength loss from the peak strength. And the accuracy of drift capacity predictions are critical during the seismic design process with implications to construction costs, seismic safety, and reliability. When reinforced concrete walls are used as the primary lateral force resisting system, special boundary elements are typically required in the plastic hinge regions of walls to allow walls to exhibit ductile behavior under cyclical lateral loading. Prior to 2019's version of ACI 318, it was presumed that walls satisfying these special detailing requirements possessed drift capacities that exceeded the expected design level drift demands. However, recent studies have shown that the design provisions contained in ACI 318 were actually inadequate, and that there are other factors aside from detailing that significantly influenced wall deformation capacity. So following these concerns, multiple studies were conducted to create empirical models for predicting drift capacity that examine the impact of parameters other than the boundary elements on drift capacity. And the most recent effort was conducted here at UCLA by Professor Abdullah and Wallace. And they used an experimental database to create a linear regression model for drift capacity prediction that was adopted under ACI 318 to 319 and is currently in use. Unfortunately, linear regression models are often unable to fully capture the really complex behavior that is expected under seismic action. So the model developed by the Abdullah and Wallace study was based on an assumed linear relationship between the relevant input parameters and the drift capacity. But examination of the test data reveals that there's actually nonlinearities that exist between the predictor and the response variables. So machine learning methods actually have the ability to capture complex nonlinear relationships between influencing variables on drift capacity. So by adopting machine learning methods, we can improve predictive capabilities. And although machine learning methods outperform previously developed models with regards to drift capacity prediction, there are definitely barriers to its more widespread adoption. Machine learning files can often be really cumbersome to share and implement, and they can be really intimidating, especially for someone without a computer science background, which within the structural engineering community might be true for a lot of individuals. And this is where a web app comes into play, which can provide a really neat solution. A web application can provide a super accessible platform for machine learning models, since it's just a link that can be shared and opened on any machine. It also provides a way for the people who are designing these machine learning models to create really simple user interfaces to facilitate and really encourage the use of the model as intended. So I'd like to just briefly touch on the process I took to develop the web app, or the steps someone who potentially would like to develop a web application would need to take to do so. So to start off, some basic Python knowledge is required just to be able to develop the script for the machine learning model, as well as the file that runs the web application. And Python is an interpreted language just like MATLAB, which I know is pretty common to know. So it's just a matter of learning a little bit of syntax. And then afterwards, you will need a trained machine learning model. And for my purposes, I just used the model that was developed as part of the research. So here, what I have shown is just a snippet of what the script for the model looks like. And this study used the XGBoost algorithm to develop the machine learning model. So generally the way that machine learning models work are that they're developed by professionals and then conveniently put into packages that can be imported into any Python script. So at the top, I'm just importing the XGBoost algorithm to use in my script. And there are many machine learning algorithms out there, and they all work slightly differently. But at a very high level, the XGBoost algorithm is a tree-based method that builds decision trees sequentially. So decision trees branch at decision nodes where a binary question regarding whatever variable is in consideration is posed. And then at each iteration of gradient boosting, residuals are used to correct the previous predictors. So essentially what's happening is that weak learners are being combined into a single stronger ML model. So here, the parameters that are numerical are just being read in from a spreadsheet, and then the categorical variables are being manipulated in a manner that makes sense to feed into the model and train it. And then afterwards, the script just performs regression on the parameters. And then finally, at the end, there's a trained model which can produce a prediction. And then afterwards, the model needs to be saved in a format that can be shared outside the Python notebook it exists. And I just use the Python pickle module, which is essentially designed to store a model with all the information necessary to reconstruct it in another script. And then finally, I developed the script that would be responsible for running the web app. So obviously the first thing that would need to be done is to read in the machine learning model so it can run on the back end of the app. And then to create the graphical user interface for the script, which is what the user would actually see and interact with, I used Streamlit, which is an open source Python library, which is made specifically to create visual tools for machine learning models and data science projects. And Streamlit has a super extensive documentation of the so-called widgets that can be utilized in a Python script. So at this point in time, obviously the script that I've developed for the web application is too long to display right here, but I just selected a few lines from the script. So this is a demonstration of the select box widget, which basically here in the code, I've specified that I'd like overlapping hoops and the single perimeter hoops to be the two drop-down options in the select box menu for the app. And depending on which of the two options the user were to select, the variable x12 in my code would be updated to either 60 or 45, and then this value would be fed into the model. So that's just a really simple demonstration of one of the features and how the code would appear on the web app. And making machine learning models easier to use are not the only reasons why the web apps are such powerful tools. So web apps are also a really great way to present and organize informational content in a really logical and succinct and understandable fashion. So a really important part of developing the web app was to think about the entire user experience of going onto the site. And it was really important that in addition to having access to the machine learning model and obviously the computational power it holds, for the user to also get an intuition as to why the model was developed and the major factors that went into its development in that really limited time that they're going to be spending on the site. So to really illustrate the functionalities of web apps, I'm just going to be sharing the web app that I made. And it's still a work in progress, so it's only functional on my local machine. But the goal is definitely to have it accessible to anyone who would like to use it in the future. So when a user is to first come onto this web app, this is the homepage that they'll see. And here are just a few lines that first define drift capacity and then establish that it was the XGBoost algorithm and 3 input parameters that were used to develop the model. And here's just a visual illustration of gradient boosting, which is used to come to a drift capacity prediction. And then here's just a little visual for the drift capacity. And then as I mentioned a few moments ago, there were 3 main parameters that were identified as the most influential in terms of drift capacity prediction. And this is just a page that briefly touches on what each of the parameters are. So the most influential parameter was the slenderness. And this parameter just accounts for the slenderness of the cross-section and the compression zone of the wall. And then afterwards, the next most influential parameter was the shear stress demand, which was the experimental shear stress divided by the square root of the concrete compressive strength. So just intuitively, as the shear stress demand increased, it would be expected for the drift capacity to decrease. And then the data set that was used to develop the model included 5 different boundary configurations, and the orientation of the elements within these reinforcement made it so that drift capacity would be either increased or would be expected to either increase or decrease, just depending on how the elements are oriented. So for example, in the case of the overlapping hoops, drift capacity would be expected to increase, while in the combination of perimeter hoops and cross ties with the 90-135 degree hooks, drift capacity would be expected to decrease. And then these considerations were factored into the model development. And here are just some more configurations that were present in the data set. And then really the impetus behind this entire research project was to improve the predictive capabilities of this linear regression model. So this page just has an interactive way for the user to work with this linear regression model, where they can enter their own values for the 3 variables that appear on the left-hand side, and a drift capacity prediction will be produced in this data frame. But obviously this is not something you would need a web app for necessarily. It could be really easily done on your calculator. And this is where we get to the heart of the web app, which is the machine learning model for drift capacity prediction. So here the user is prompted to enter parameters for the 3 main inputs for the model. So I'm just going to enter in some arbitrary values to demo. So here is just lambda b being computed over here. And then I can put something in for the shear stress demand and select a reinforcement configuration. And then as you can see, in less than a second, the ML model, which is on the back end of this site, is reading in all of these values and producing a drift capacity prediction. And this is obviously something you would normally need a program to run, and this is something that a web app is able to do. And I hope that this demo is really able to show how the web app is able to make machine learning models really accessible and really user-friendly. So it was a pleasure to present today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions to the best of my abilities.
Hi, I have a question. That was really good presentation. For your web app, do you not need a hardware in the background? So what would you be running this on? I mean, I know you're running it on your computer, but would you be able to run this on a server? What kind of infrastructure do you need to be able to run it and do the computations?
So currently it's running on my local machine, but we'd have to find a way to host it on like a public domain if we'd like to get the web app to be like a shareable link. So I know that, I think Peter did a tutorial on this actually, where he hosted on AWS, but I'm still looking into the options, but that's definitely going to be a really significant part of the development of the web app. And that's currently the stage that I'm about to start. So I'll keep you updated on that as we start that part of it.
Okay, and this is with Professor Burton, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, all right, thank you. Very good presentation.
Thank you.
Oh, I have another question. Does anybody have other questions? I don't want to hog, but I'm used to using Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebooks. How does that compare to what you're using, which is Streamlit? What's the main difference between them?
So Streamlit is a package that can be run on like any sort of platform. So I'm just using Xcode, but I'm sure that it could be done on other platforms. I don't know if you have anything to add to this, Peter, because I know you're a lot more versed in Streamlit.
So thank you for inviting me, but Streamlit is like just another package. So like in Python, you have like NumPy, I don't know, scikit-learn, or I forgot all the packages because there's just so many, but Streamlit is just one of those packages that you download and run. So technically you can run it on Jupyter Notebook or I don't know, any other machine that runs Python.
Okay, yeah, that was my understanding, but I just wanted to make sure I wasn't saying something entirely wrong.
Okay,
But,
so
yeah.
adding widgets, just like PyWidget, it's
Mhm.
Jupyter Notebooks. This is just another one. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
All right, if there's no, let's wait a few seconds. Does anyone have any more questions? If not, we can move on to the next presenter. Thank you, Tricia. It was a great presentation. Next up, we have Peter.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, I'm having a bit of difficulty sharing my screen, so give me a second.
Take your time.
Thanks. Can you see the screen now?
Yep, I can see your slides.
Awesome. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Changhyun or Peter Lee, and my presentation is on tracking the progression of retrofits for the Los Angeles Soft Story Ordinance with a focus on the effect of socioeconomic factors and inequities in temporal seismic risk reduction. And I should admit that that was a mouthful. It was a really long title, but in essence, I will go over mainly 3 areas. So first, I'll cover the current status quo under the LA Soft Story Ordinance, and then examine how various socioeconomic factors have affected the progress in achieving those retrofits, and finally, how the differences result in overall inequities in the risk reduction under a hypothetical magnitude 7 event. So back in last June, Professor Burton suggested that I look into the trends and potential inequities in the soft story retrofits, which I thought was very fitting because it was around the time when all the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were gaining traction. And around the same time, I also learned that my very own apartment in Westwood is a soft story building and it was undergoing retrofit for the summer. And while talking to my landlord, I learned that he was very, what should I say, annoyed about the retrofit because it was obviously generating a lot of noise as well as traffic issues. And this was personally very interesting because it gave me a bit more insight as to why some people might actually be against or be reluctant with undergoing retrofits for their buildings. So what exactly is a soft story building to begin with? Soft story structures are officially defined as multi-story wood frame buildings with soft, weak, or open front wall lines are buildings where the ground floor wall density is much lower compared to the other stories. And so this results in a significant difference in strength and stiffness between the first story and the rest of the adjacent stories, and it renders the structure very prone to collapse during an earthquake. The city of LA has recognized this issue and they passed a citywide ordinance in October of 2015 that essentially mandates that all soft story buildings be retrofitted if they were built using codes passed before 1978. And there are a couple ways to achieve this retrofit, such as moment frames, spatial cantilever columns, and sometimes shear walls. The LA Department of Building and Safety periodically updates this progress on soft story retrofits, and for the purposes of the study, data from August of 2020 was used. And since some of the data provided were inconsistent, they were verified and filtered based on permit records that I got from the LA Open Data Portal. Under the current ordinance, the retrofit progress is divided into mainly 3 compliance levels or tiers. There's level 1, where the owner submits a proof of retrofit or the plan to retrofit. Level 2, where the department issues the permit to start the retrofit construction. And level 3, where the building has been fully retrofitted. This is a spatial distribution of the soft story buildings in Los Angeles, and at first glance, the overall distribution of the compliance levels appears to be very random. And the noise mainly comes from the fact that, from the sheer number of buildings, which is on the order of 13,000 buildings scattered throughout the county. And so I'll address this issue later on. To get an overall sense of the status quo, I disaggregated the raw data in Python using a variety of parameters, and the first of which is building type. Here we can see that roughly 40% of the buildings had been fully retrofitted as of August of 2020. And between the different building types, apartments show the greatest rate of retrofit completion, followed by condos and single-family housing. This is a histogram of the duration to achieve each compliance level, and it's pretty apparent that buildings in general take a much shorter time to attain lower compliance levels, which is as expected. And moreover, level 1 shows a left skewed distribution, while levels 2 and 3 are more roughly normally distributed. To analyze the effect of socioeconomic status on the overall retrofit progress, I got data on income, race, and educational attainment for LA County from the US Census Bureau, and they were assigned to each building based on their locations using QGIS. And again, for better comparison, each socioeconomic profile was divided into 4 quartiles. For instance, the first income quartile corresponds to the 25% lowest income group, while the 4th quartile corresponds to the 25% highest income group. And the duration to achieve level 3 compliance was found for each quartile. It's worth noting here that there was really no clear distinction based on the percentage of African American or percentage of Asian population, which I found was pretty interesting. However, for median income, percent white population, and percentage of high school graduates, higher quartiles tended to have a shorter median duration to achieve retrofit. The trend was actually reversed for Hispanic Latino populations, with the first quartile with the lowest Hispanic Latino population having the shortest duration to achieve retrofit, as can be seen here. In addition to looking at the duration to achieve retrofit, trajectories were also generated by plotting the proportion of fully retrofitted, or basically compliance level 3 buildings against time. And these were done for the 6 profiles previously discussed, but only the 2 plots with the greatest duration difference between the 1st and 4th quartiles are shown. And I think one key thing worth noticing here is that the quartile with the highest Hispanic Latino population, or the one with the lowest high school graduates, are lagging behind, as can be seen in the red and blue curves. And the differences are 10.1 and 13.6% relatively. And for a higher level analysis that accounts for all 3 compliance levels, I tried analyzing the individual building data, but it turned out to be way too noisy to yield any meaningful results. So to resolve this issue, I found an average for each census tract. So basically, I took the mean compliance levels for all the buildings, which are shown in pink dots on this little map of sorts. And then I consolidated that for each tract, which are now the individual blue dots. So the figure on the left is a color plot that shows the mean compliance level for each census tract, and the axes of median income and percentage of high school graduates were just selected for visualization purposes because they happen to have like the best apparent trend. And here we can see that the lagging tracts, which are mainly shown in purple, are clustered around lower income as well as lower educational attainment areas. The geographical distribution is also shown on the right, and the tracts with no retrofit having begun at all, which is like a mean level of exactly 1, are highlighted in blue. And one thing worth noting is that 65% of these blue tracts had a median income lower than the LA County average. To finally study the effect of these various discrepancies on the overall seismic risk reduction, the losses were found for each building based on a hypothetical magnitude 7.1 Fuente Hills event scenario. And I used 32 archetypes developed by Professor Burton that accounted for differences such as building layout and number of stories, and they were randomly assigned to the 13,000 building inventory. I should also stress that Dr. E was the person who was chiefly responsible for running the simulations and also provided the loss data for all the buildings for both before and after the retrofit, and this was mainly based on FEMA P15 methodologies. So to generate the trajectory of the loss reduction, the losses were actually calculated for every single day from October of 2015 to August of 2020. And assuming that the Puente Hills earthquake occurred on that very day. And the losses for each building on that day was assigned based on whether the building had attained level 3 compliance before that date or not. And so the total loss was then found by summing all the individual building losses. And we can see that with 40% of the total inventory having been retrofitted as of August 2020, there has been a 7.9% reduction in losses. So the previous trajectory was then disaggregated based on the 4 socioeconomic profiles of median income, percent white population, percent Hispanic Latino population, and percentage of high school graduates. For the profiles of median income, the trajectories were fairly evenly split with not a lot of apparent lags. But for the percentage of Hispanic and Latino population, the trajectory with the highest population, which is the red curve shown here, had the lowest reduction in losses with an apparent gap that was around 19.6% lower than the next quartile, which is a relative difference, not an absolute percentage difference. So I noted the differences here. And as for the percentage of white and high school graduate profiles, there were indeed gaps in the profiles, but I just found that the lower 2 performing quartiles of basically orange and blue lines were more apparent compared to the top 2 quartiles, which were more or less clustered together. But again, this is a kind of subjective observation. So in conclusion, the trajectories are not drastically different across the different profiles, but I thought it was very worthwhile to note that the curves or the trajectories for each projectile, or the quartiles, never really crisscross. They are very distinct and consistent with our previous observations. Higher median income, percent white, and percent high school graduates tended to have a greater retrofit progress. And this can be interpreted in mainly 2 ways, either as having a shorter duration to achieve the retrofit, but also as of August 2020, more of the buildings have been retrofitted in those areas or quartiles. Some room for improvement is, first of all, better data quality, because I was forced to use the 2010 US Census since at the time the 2020 US Census was underway. And I think another key potential improvement could be using more earthquake simulations, because as you can see, both the demographic profiles as well as the location of the soft story buildings are highly spatially correlated. So only using one epicenter location in Fuente Hills might have affected the results significantly. But again, running more epicenter location simulations is highly computationally demanding. I think this little study matters for mainly 2 reasons. The first is that it clearly highlights that there are communities that are lagging significantly behind others, and those are mainly in East Side and South of Los Angeles. So it'll be great to have some kind of more public funding allocated to those areas and bringing the retrofit progress up to date. But at the same time, the overall experience throughout the project, as well as talking with my landlord, kind of suggested that there is a greater need to convey the benefits of retrofits through either fiscal or some kind of tangible metric, because as of now, the general public thinks of this more as a burdensome task rather than something that is really worthwhile. So I think that is a step that we need to take in the future. With that, I'd like to say thank you for listening to my presentation. And also I would like to thank Professor Burton and Dr. Yi for their really continued support throughout the whole project. And I appreciate any questions, comments, or concerns.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Abhimanyu Singh, and today I will be presenting my research on comprehensive coupling beam database and its results. Just a brief background about my research. I started this research in the summer of 2020, and it's currently an ongoing project. In today's presentation, I'll be going over a brief summary of the database and the analysis of fiber reinforced concrete coupling beams and its shear strength equation. So just an outline of the presentation, I'll be going over the introduction of coupling beams and my objectives, then just a summary of the coupling beam database, and then moving on to classification, analysis of coupling beams, and narrowing it to the regression model for steel fiber reinforced coupling beam. So before we begin, just a review of what exactly is a coupling beam. Coupling beam is a lateral force releasing component of a structure. They're used effectively when two shear walls or any other elements that are used for withstanding lateral loads is combined. This subsequently decreases overturning effect and improves overall stiffness of the system. Therefore, the main function of coupling beam is dissipation of energy and improving stiffness and strength of lateral load system of the structure. Here you can see on my right, this is a diagonally reinforced coupling beam, and here's one shear wall that's going to come in, and one on the right. So next up, so before we move on, I just want to briefly talk about the experiments and the typical setup of coupling beam experiments, which aims to replicate shear force experienced by coupling beam during a seismic event. The horizontal actual provides shear to the blocks, which kind of represent shear walls, which are highly stiff, and then observations are made on behalf of the beam. On the right, we have a test setup from Han et al. 2015, which is quite different from the left one, which is from Saman's paper. But here the shear force is being applied at the center of the beam. So just a couple of different setups. So moving on to the objectives now. So the objective of the database is to create a more comprehensive and robust database, which includes conventional diagonal and steam reinforced concrete coupling beams, but also fiber reinforced coupling beam as well. I'll be going in depth about the types of coupling beam in the later part of the presentation. But yeah, so as everyone knows that reinforcement congestion has been a long vein of concrete construction in high seismic regions. Some of the most difficult and consistent reinforcement is found in shear walls of coupling beams. As you saw in the previous slide, the diagonal reinforcements, they were too much steel and really hard to pour concrete. So traditionally, diagonal bars are used to reinforce these coupling beams, and highly tight spaced stirrups are used. This creates a significant congestion and kind of conflict between the diagonal bars and the shear walls. So steel fiber reinforced concrete coupling beams can be used for designing in the region of high seismicity, which can provide strength and add ductility and kind of remove the diagonal bars, which is kind of an innovative way to save significant labor and material cost. The objective of steel fiber reinforced concrete coupling beam modeling is aiming to develop a shear strength equation out of that. And currently we have 38 test specimens for that. So the goal is to create a shear strength equation and later on move on to propose a modeling parameters and acceptance criteria for seismic evaluation and retrofit, which is ASC 41. So just a brief overview of the database. So initially we started collecting papers, reports, and theses and dissertations, and compiling them into a folder which contains the main report or paper. So far we have 600 Beam tests from about 200 test programs. And yeah, so now the question is, what kind of data are we extracting from these reports? So just a brief summary of the data is we're kind of gathering the longitudinal and diagonal reinforcement, any kind of like stirrups and cross ties. If there is a slab, the detailings of the slab, and experimental results, which include the backbone curve, reported rotation, concrete cover spalling, rebar buckling, failure, and kind of the failure mode. So next up, we have just a snippet of the database. The columns go on and on, but these are just this is just a summary of it. Just the general information of about the experiment. The geometry, it includes everything about the geometry, and penetration or the hole in webs, if there is any, and concrete properties. So as you can see, it's highly detailed, and it's done through reading like all the papers and kind of putting everything in Excel sheet, so that you can like reading it from there, you can get a summary of what exactly happened in the experiment. So moving on to, as you know, the database has like currently more than 350 specimens. But to make it more comprehensive, we had to like set up columns and divide each sections for further classification. So we will be going over typical classifications, which were used to segregate the data in the later stages of data analysis. Now we have the distribution of coupling beams based on the cross-section geometry. Most of the documented beams, they are rectangular in nature, and some of the beams are T-shaped. The T-shaped geometry is associated to slabs, basically on top of coupling beams, which is usually the case in the buildings. But most of the experiments are for rectangular cross-section. Moving on, next we have the different types of reinforcements that we accounted. As you know, ACI accounts for conventional and diagonal coupling beams, but we saw a couple of more types of reinforcements which are documented in the database. Some of them are hybrid, which includes diagonal and rhombic coupling beams, longitudinal and diagonal coupling beams, which both of them are developed into the blocks, and longitudinal and rhombic coupling beams. So just a couple of more than what there are in ACI 318. This is just a summary of the reinforcement types distribution, and most of them are conventional, but as you can see, we have longitudinal and diagonal hybrid combination as well, and the list goes on. So in the future, the data could be analyzed for different kinds of reinforcements, and there could be new provisions added in the ACI for their associated perks. Now moving to the classifications of coupling beam based on fiber reinforced concrete. So referencing the ASTM standards, the concrete coupling beams were divided, like the fiber reinforced concrete was divided into 5 types, and high performance fiber was also further added later on. So just a summary of this one as well, because this is crucial for the analysis of steel fiber. So as you can see, the database mostly has steel fiber, which is like not much, but 37 specimens and account for 55%. So therefore, steel fiber concrete coupling beam was used for analysis purposes. So next up, we have some literature review on fiber reinforced coupling beam, and reading Perra's paper and Bukowski and Kai's. I included a couple of more columns, which include fiber length, fiber diameter, the aspect ratio of the fiber, the yield strength of the fiber, and the volumetric ratio of the fiber. So, and these parameters will be later used in regression models. So they were kind of important. So yes, from literature review, I came across 2 models which were simplifying the shear strength equation of coupling beams. As you can see, Zhang's model there is a modification factor lambda f, which includes the volumetric ratio and the aspect ratio of the fiber. So it kind of like boosts up the shear strength of the beam, but it kind of lacks the aspect ratio element to the beam. Kai's, on the other hand, included the component of fiber reinforced concrete beam and also the aspect ratio as well. As you can see, ln over d, this whole equation was later on modified with the aspect ratio, so which was good. Now, I went through the process of replicating these equations, but unfortunately for Kai's model, I wasn't able to do so, and I reached out to Professor Kai, and as you can see, the covariance was 1.5, mean is kind of low, and this equation doesn't quite accurately predict what was happening, kind of happening in what exactly was written in the paper. So something that I'm currently working on, but I kind of took inspiration from this equation. Next up, this is the same table, but with more in-depth analysis of contribution of concrete, fiber, and the same equation remodeled. But as you can see, the expected over model is still not sufficient. Next, I checked Zhang's model, and again, the lambda f was including the volumetric ratio and the aspect ratio, but you can see the equation was not able to take into account the aspect ratio, and we have a trend going downwards as the aspect ratio increases. So something just to account for when I thought of doing the regression. So I tried to run a regression model with variables used from the literature. So the volumetric ratio, F prime C, area, B sub W, the depth of the beam, the spacing, and the beam aspect ratio. And the feature, and I tried to develop the feature engineering. I tried to feature engineer the parameters, but as we know, we only have like 37, 38 data points. It didn't make sense because there will be interaction terms involved. So I dropped the idea of feature engineering, and I ran a 3-4 cross validation to generate the data from the results from the limited data. Next up, we have the 4 main parameters that I took to model. And first, we have the aspect ratio, the x1, x2, the fiber aspect ratio, volumetric fiber, and the shear contribution of transverse reinforcement. And the experimental value was divided over BH square root of F prime C, and I'm modeling for Y sub true based on these 4 parameters. So I split the data and split the training set and the validation set 80:20 because the data is small and I wanted to predict for better evaluation. So 80% was a good approximation, and all the features were normalized so to provide equal weights to each parameter. And the new polynomial features were generated based on the interaction terms. And 100 iterations were performed to get a sufficient beta factors because we have a small data set and there could be high anomalies. So as you can see, this is what I'm basically accounting for. Next up, I calculate the beta factors from the x1, x2, x3, x4. And as you can see, there was no regularization, there was no cost feature attached to it. So all the parameters were kind of interacting with each other, but this was a shortcoming of this, which I'll be correcting soon. But the model was doing amazing, except for two outliers, which I'm currently studying right now. R square was not that good, but the MSE was spectacular. It was very small mean square error, which I found really good. And the data was, this is the Y predicted over number of specimens, and it's around 1, which is good. And it's also accounting for the aspect ratio, which Zhang's model was not able to do so. So I was happy with this model. But as you know, that there were too many expressions, there are too many, the equation was too long. So now I'm going to run a Lasso regression model on the current equation to kind of eliminate the features that are not necessary. So here's just a snippet of my model, but I'm currently working on Lasso. So let's see what it gives us. Before I wrap up, I would like to really thank and acknowledge Dr. Saman Abdullah, Matthias Rojas, Professor Wallace for their constant support, guidance, and constant effort during the research. This brings an end to the presentation on the comprehensive coupling beam database. Thank you so much for your attention. Yep. Please feel free to ask any questions.
I had a question on the accuracy. I think it was slide 28.
Yes.
So like, I'm just wondering, like, since your total data set was like 38 data points or specimens, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just like really surprised that the accuracy is really high, which is impressive. But I noticed that like the accuracy kind of like degrades after like specimen number 20. So was there like the test set in your training, or because I feel like the first 20 are like almost perfect. So is there like a reason why it kind of like degrades after 20, or is that just a coincidence?
I think it's a coincidence because I ran like almost 100 iterations to kind of prevent this kind of behavior. So because as you know, the data set was way too small and we had to run like multiple iterations to get an okay beta factor. So I think this is just a coincidence in this one, but yeah.
That's very interesting, but thanks.
Yeah, one thing I got to know was even though like your R square could be not the best, but that's not the only parameter that one needs to look for. As you can see, the MSE was way too small. Yeah. Any other questions? Right. Thank you so much.
Great presentation, Abhi. I guess we will move on to the Q&A panel section, and Carrie will be coordinating that and starting it.
Yeah, thanks again to all of the presenters. You did a fantastic job. And now we get to hear from you a little bit of the background context to getting involved with your work. So I'm going to pose a couple questions to begin with, and then we can open up to anyone in the audience who has something to ask as well. And so remember, the goal of this Q&A is basically to empower our peers and future researchers to have the information and encouragement they need to pursue this type of work themselves. So with that, I'll start off with the first question. How did you get into research? And moreover, how has this experience impacted you in your undergrad career? So maybe we could start off with Tricia.
Yeah, for sure. So I got into research earlier this year by reaching out to Professor Burton. And I just expressed interest in joining his group because his group does a lot of projects related to structures and also applying computer science to structural engineering projects. And I wanted to get involved in projects that dealt with both of those areas. And Professor Burton's my faculty advisor, so I'd been talking to him a few times before, and I also saw a posting, I think on EERI-SEAOSC's page, that you were looking for an undergrad researcher. And even though like I didn't necessarily meet the eligibility requirements in terms of like, I think he was looking for a junior or a senior, I thought it wouldn't hurt to just reach out to him and let him know that I was interested in that project. And it sort of went from there. He thought that the grad student that I mentioned that I did the project for would be a really good fit for my interests. And he found a way for me to get involved in that project. And then in terms of how research has impacted me, I think it's been a really good way to expand the breadth of the material that I was dealing with beyond just the coursework I was taking at school. And it was a really great way to get exposure to pretty advanced like civil engineering and structural engineering content that under normal circumstances I probably wouldn't get exposure to until maybe my junior or senior year. So that was definitely like really exciting.
Thanks. I think you bring a unique perspective being a first year who hasn't, I assume, been on campus really yet, already getting plugged into the department work. Thanks for being here. Kyle, how about you? How did you get into research and how has it impacted your experience?
Yeah, I actually got into research after I met someone at one of the research roundtables, interestingly. So, and here I am planning for research roundtables. So after the research roundtable, I went up to someone and introduced it myself and expressed my interest on doing research with it. And in terms of how the research impacted me, working with someone, I got to know a lot about Rainforest concrete columns and understand why columns are detailed in a certain way. And it definitely helped me give me a perspective on why columns are designed a certain way in the industry. And it definitely helped me to get into a conversation about structural engineering when I interview with companies, and this experience also helped me to realize that structural engineering is something that I want to pursue further in the future. And yeah, that's how much research has impacted me.
Thanks, Kyle. Peter, how about you? How has research played a big role in your undergrad?
I think it has impacted me in mainly two ways. So like the first, I guess, more superficial reason is that it has definitely opened up my eyes. Like before I could take the upper dips, which I think a lot of the other folks echoed. But I think the other big reason for me personally is it made me a more patient and tenacious person, because research in general is not really like textbook or cut off or straightforward. It's not like you get a homework and you just grind and you just get something out and then you move on. It's more like at least like 4 different paths, and at each moment you're like debating which path you're going to take, and if you're down to spend like a whole day down that rabbit hole, and sometimes that ends to like leads to a dead end and you have to come back to that crossroads and then start again. But I feel like I was personally really frustrated my first 2 years because I thought like I need results right away, but the results didn't come after like 2 weeks. But I think I'm getting more used to that process, and also I'm enjoying like the random and odd things that I learn like in those like rabbit hole chases.
Gotcha. That's good insight. How did you initially get involved?
So I did a work study at the Garrick Institute as a freshman, and I did like a lot of web design for their LinkedIn and website. But one day Professor Burton came and gave a little, I guess, talk on his current research. And before then, I was like kind of like debating if I should stay in structural engineering, because I was kind of bored of like with all the mechanics and analysis portion of things. But then he really expanded my vision in terms of like how far reaching our work can be, and that kind of like sparked a lot of interest in me, because I was more interested in like the social I guess outreach or just reliability aspect of things. And then this the project that I just presented on was really rewarding for me, because it was the first project that I did with him that was not entirely computer science based or programming, but more looking at the bigger scale of things.
Thanks. Avi, what do you have to say to respond to these questions?
So I got into research my sophomore year in fall through ERI Roundtable, where I met Dr. Saman, and I was really blown away by his presentation, and that got me like really interested in coupling beams, and I started working with him, and I think yeah, I started volunteering, and then I started off as a summer research intern. And since then, I've never looked back, and I'm still working with him. Yeah, and my research experience has like helped me like early on in my career, because during sophomore year, I was working in the lab, and like I used to understand the material behavior, the concrete behavior, and upcoming new, like I was introduced to performance-based design, performance-based wind design in my sophomore year, which I was kind of very lucky, and it kind of like helped me understand research in general, and I kind of understood that, like Peter said, it requires patience, and I really like merged in well with research and helped me like, you know, get out of my comfort zone, and like Peter said, not a homework problem. So that's kind of nice about it.
Totally different game. Thanks. And now I want to ask our special guest panelist, Omar, alumni of UCLA, veteran researcher in our undergrad researcher in our department. Tell us about how you would respond to these questions.
That's very nice of you, Carrie. Thank you. So first of all, I would say like, to the first question, getting into research wasn't like a trivial task for me. It requires a little bit of bravery to talk to your professor and kind of ask them, hey, like I want to get my hands onto something. But I actually, even though I came into UCLA as a, like kind of thinking, oh, I'm going to be a structural engineer, I actually asked Professor Brandenburg first if I could do research with him after the soil class, just because like he was such a down to earth person, and I didn't think soil mechanics could be so fun. So I thought, okay, why not get involved? And many of the people on the call will probably be familiar with the Next Generation Liquefaction project. It's a really easy research project to get involved with if you're an undergrad. And I got involved with that, and I stayed there for probably more than a year at least. And I think it was great because for the first time, it's kind of like you can dive in and answer certain questions about the future before you get to that point. So I think an overarching theme that we hear with a lot of, I think that the panelists echo this quite well, is that getting into research as an undergrad kind of answers what you don't know, because you don't really know what you don't know when you first enter UCLA, because you're kind of like exposed to all this civil engineering stuff. And it's just like, there's like 20 or 30 sub-disciplines in civil engineering. But if you can get your hands on research, you can like start to like narrow things down and say, hey, I actually really like this, or maybe I don't like this, you know? And that's very empowering, and that enables you to make decisions faster. And so research in that way as an undergraduate really kind of helps propel you forward. For me, at least, I actually realized that I like earthquake engineering. So I didn't end up kind of like doubling down on geotech, but I realized that I actually do really care about some of the things in geotechnical earthquake engineering. And so I ended up getting into this kind of more like earthquake engineering space. And even in graduate school, I realized like that's my passion. And I wouldn't actually be doing the research I'm doing now if I didn't experiment a lot during my undergrad.
That's good insight. Thanks. Okay, let's move on to our next question. I'll open this to whoever wants to respond first. But what is some advice you have for students who want to get involved in research? And should the approach of getting involved or reaching out differ depending on your year of study in undergrad? And just kind of any tips and tricks that you have that have gotten your foot in the door, or what it takes to get there and then enjoy it along the way, anything along these realms.
Okay, I want to answer this first, just because like I feel like it's a good continuation of my previous little speech. So if you want to get into research as an undergrad, my advice, first of all, is to be brave and to just not care about what your qualifications are. Honestly, just be passionate, care, and I think you're going to be fine. Now, if you're somebody who is in their first or second year, my recommendation is really just to take the CEE 99 route if you're really like kind of concerned about kind of the logistics, there's a very simple way to get involved, a very low kind of stakes way, and that's just to fill out a CEE 99 contract with the 6th floor of Walter Hall. For those of you who haven't been to UCLA yet, it's the 6th floor. You can go in and ask them for a form. A professor simply signs on it. You write down what you're going to do, and then that's your entry into research. And it actually denotes that you received research credits on your transcript. Now, if you're in your 3rd or 4th year, you can actually like upgrade to a CE 199, and then those will count towards your GPA as well. And you can select the number of units depending on the intensity of the project. And so it's an extremely flexible framework for you to get involved. Now, the question of who do you get involved with really depends on where you're at. If you're a 1st or 2nd year, my advice is just choose something you think you might be interested in, and then just see how that goes. If you're a 3rd or 4th year, try to pick something based on like evidence on how you liked certain classes. So for example, if you liked soil mechanics, try to do something along the lines of geotech. If you like structural engineering, try to talk to like a structural engineering professor, and don't discount the relationship between you and the professor. That matters actually more than you would think, because the professor and yourself, you kind of develop a bond over the course of the research. And if you have a good mentor, that could really that could change your life and the trajectory of your academic journey. So I would say like, you can't always check off all the boxes, but even if you're not necessarily so interested in the topic, but the advisor seems to care, I would put that as that would take a high precedence in my book over something where you think you kind of know you like it, but maybe the faculty advisor is just very consumed. It's not that they don't care, it's just maybe they don't have the capacity to serve as an undergraduate advisor at this particular time. So those are like my pieces of advice, but I think a lot of people on the call right now, like you guys have a lot more experience than I do right now, because I've been out for a couple of years, but feel free to chime in and add on to that.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of my advice aligns with what Omar said. It's very important. It's important for you to get to know what the professors are working on right now and see if their research align with your goal, whether it is to getting to know more about geotechnical engineering or structural engineering, and then go talk to them and be brave and try to establish that connections so that you can send an email to them and ask if they are willing to take you on as a student researcher. And it's very important for you to establish that connection because if you want to apply to graduate school and other sort of jobs, you might need a recommendation letter. And then by working along with them for a period of time, they will get to know more about you and say how well you work with them or other side of you that really shines. So it's and so yeah, that's my advice.
Any others want to add to this before we open the floor?
Yeah, I think Omar said a really nice thing that it's important to select a good mentor, because it's not just about the research that's going to help you. Probably they could become your best friend, and it can boost like many other things other than your research interest. It can impact you in a very serious way, and it could be good or bad. So it's really important to do so, and it's like you have to be brave about that and see and test the waters yourself.
Tricia or Peter, could you maybe briefly describe the organization of a research group and the relationship you might have to a PhD candidate and on a more consistent basis versus the professor, or like who are you checking in with, how often, and anything along those lines?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot more communication between the student researcher and the PhD student as opposed to the professor, just because obviously the professor has a lot of other responsibilities. And when you have so many questions about the work that you're doing, it's a lot more comfortable to obviously approach someone who has the time and And obviously, since they're involved in the project themselves and they're conducting that research, they'd be better equipped to answer some of the more nuanced questions you might have about the research. So yeah, to answer your question, it's definitely establishing a lot more tight of a relationship with the PhD student, but the professor is definitely involved to a certain degree. So you're definitely going to be able to communicate with them as well.
Sounds like a both situation. Okay, great. I'm going to open the floor to anyone in the audience who wants to pose a question to anyone in particular or just to the panel in general. Feel free to unmute or type in the chat.
Yeah, I have a question. So this one's for Omar specifically. I was wondering what you would say the main differences are between undergrad research and graduate level research.
That's actually a really good question, because like there are some differences that are important. I think like kind of building off of the previous statements of the panelists in terms of like what undergraduate research is supposed to do. I think there was like this theme of like it being like a guide for you to like figure out what you're interested in and where you want to go, whether that's like in academia or the profession, right? Whether you do academia or professional practice, I think research can help answer some of those questions at the undergraduate level. So you can kind of like move your trajectory accordingly. But once you get to graduate school, things change a little bit because you're spending a year or two at a minimum intensely focusing on a very niche field. And so it becomes more and more important to like try and choose something that's along the lines of what you're actually like you're starting to bet on in terms of like what you're going to do. And actually, like for me specifically, speaking on personal experience, this is a really unique stage for me because I'm a master's student who's interested in doing a PhD. And so for me, it's actually considered like a test run to see if the PhD is right for me. So really graduate school research is now serving as kind of like this kind of like test to see like, do I really, number one, want to do this for more than just a year? And number two, am I really interested in some of the questions that faculty in my particular department are trying to answer? And so in graduate school, it's a little bit different. And that's kind of what I like about undergraduate research in a way, because it's like, it's more open, it's more flexible, it serves different purposes, it serves multiple purposes a lot of the times. Whereas in graduate school, it's doing a lot of the same thing, but it's a lot, you have to be a little bit more specific. And faculty, oftentimes, they're going to spend more time with you, actually one-on-one, talking to you and mentoring you. So there's also expecting kind of like an output. I kind of want to say this because like, as an undergrad, if you don't produce anything substantial, I think that's fine, as long as you're learning. And faculty are aware of that, and they consider you to be like an excellent investment of their time. But once you get to like graduate school, they're also kind of expecting a certain level of rigor in the work that you're doing, and they expect you to publish, and sometimes like, you know, like work alongside their PhD students to get like product out. Like they're trying to expand like the horizons of the knowledge in the field to some extent, right? So I wouldn't say it's like more high stakes. I would just say that by the time you're in grad school, you really start getting, you know, you're kind of getting off the training wheels and you're actually doing real work. So I think it's just important to like draw the line between those two things.
Great, thanks, Omar.
Anyone else?
I have a general question. How much would you say that you typically spend a week doing research?
Personally, I think it's what you make out of it. So like Omar said, I opted in for the 99 course when I was like in my second year. And so when I was doing that, I was expected to put in at least 4 hours a week. So I did put in 4 hours and write a mini report at the end of my course. But I think also, like Omar said, professors are understanding that you're an undergrad and research is not your #1 task at the moment. Like you're just an undergrad trying to like take courses and lower this and whatnot. So like during midterm season, when I had like 4 midterms in 1 week, I did talk to Professor Burton, and then he told me like it's totally fine if I just drop my work at that during that week and then focus on my studies, which was really nice. And I also did research during the summer, like last summer, it wasn't full-time, more like part-time, but since I was getting paid, the expectation definitely increased. And I think during that time I was working like 12 hours a week. But I think the plus or a minus with research is that it's not like a 9-to-5 job in the sense that you can just clock out and the project ends and then you can come back. It's more like some days you have to like put in a lot of work to just get something out, because oftentimes it's like your work is interrelated to like a PhD student's work or vice versa. So like sometimes you don't get any input from the other person, so you're like just sitting idle for like 3 days, and other days you're like getting a lot of input, and then you have to like just process it for the whole day or even 2 days. And sometimes like not pulling all-nighters because it's like not enforced on you, but like at least from like my experience, I've stayed up to like 11 at night to like just get something out and then send out emails and then go to sleep. But yeah, it's really what you make out of it, and also what the PhD student you're working with demands of you.
Yeah, I also agree with what Peter said. It really depends on what you make out of it. The project that Sarah and I work on is a database, so it requires a consistent effort because you basically need to we basically need to review a lot of research papers and then coordinate with someone to see if the data are correct and make sure that the database is accurate. So and I think I typically work 4 or 5 hours a week on the database, and sometimes I work more. So that depends. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like there are like two sets of expectations. One from the project point of view, and there's like things that are like your own expectation for yourself. So like you're not required to pull an all-nighter, but sometimes you just feel like you have to get it done because all the ideas are clicking in right now. So you may pull off an all-nighter, but it's like it works like both sides. Like the expectations could be different, but yeah, on an average it could vary a lot. Like could be 5, could be more than that. I usually probably work around 10 hours a week.
I have a question for the panel. How do you deal with the challenge of facing technical content that seems like it's going over your head? Or if you're asked to do like a literature review or read a paper and you don't know what it's saying? Or how do you kind of approach that whole process of dealing with work that is a few years beyond you, perhaps, or more?
I guess it's like a good question for me because I had literally no idea what the research paper I was dealing with had to say, and what personally helped me was to try to go through it like a little bit at a time, and then consult either like external resources to clarify things that I found were redundant within the paper, and then also like just compiling a list of questions so that I just have all my like doubts sort of consolidated for when I would next meet with the PhD student, and then have just like an organized way to approach her and ask for those clarifications. And that definitely helped me get like even a rudimentary understanding of like the work she was doing, because it was pretty advanced.
Can I add something to that? If you're reading a technical paper and you know and understand everything that's in it, there's no need to read the paper. Most technical papers are new things. And so I hope that every time you read a paper, at least half of it is not something that's taken for granted. So it's okay to, I mean, even in my old age, when I read a paper, half of it I don't understand it, which is the point of the paper, is to challenge you and new things. So if you know and understand everything in the paper, it's not a good paper, then it's a textbook. So don't get discouraged if you don't understand something in a paper or in a presentation, because that's the point of it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. We have a question from Cassidy in the chat. were there skills or knowledge that you feel that you needed before to conduct your research?
I think I can answer that, because when I first got involved with research, I was probably like, I think either my sophomore or junior year, and I pretty much did not know what I was doing when I first heard like the professor or even the research scientist I was working with describe the project. Usually what will happen is there will be like a general theme, and then you'll probably sit down with the person you'll be working most closely with for like an hour, and then you're going to talk about what's going on. And usually if that person is like understands that you're kind of at like your stage at UCLA, they will take the time to break things down for you. And because you're only looking at a very, very specific problem, after like the fourth or fifth time they describe a certain concept to you, it starts to kind of take shape. And oftentimes you're only working with maybe like one or two different, like maybe past papers they published. You might read those for general guidance. But really, I would say like if you just spend 1 week like reading about the certain problem they're trying to solve, you can get up to speed pretty fast. And actually, if you think about like what you're actually doing in the research, a lot of time it's not like thinking like in the movies where you're like on a chalkboard and like writing down equations. It's really more or less like opening up Excel and using Excel. A lot of the times you're actually doing things that you already have done before. Maybe you might use like a GIS platform and it takes like 3 hours to learn that, or maybe you're gonna code something up in MATLAB, and you probably had a MATLAB class and you can probably do that too. Sometimes even like if I don't know how to like write down a particular algorithm that a professor suggests, I literally just go on YouTube and I'm like, how to code this particular algorithm, and I literally just follow it that way. And it turns out great. The professor is very happy with me, but I don't tell them like, hey, I just looked it up on YouTube. Like, I mean, I feel like everyone kind of has similar experiences. So to answer your question short, I can assure you that you can sometimes enter in, as long as you're motivated and disciplined and you have a good mentor, you can probably get away with maybe like very little to no background knowledge. But I don't know how the other panelists feel, but that's at least how I felt when I started.
Yeah, my experience definitely rhymes with Omar's experience. So it's important to have a good mentor. Saman really provided a lot of support along the way. So whenever I have questions, I'll write them down while reviewing the research papers. And like Omar said, it's gonna be hard in the beginning because you don't know about the terms. But once you start to look at the term several times in the context of the research paper or other contexts, you start to get an idea of what it means. And then after you Google it or ask your mentor about it, you really, after a week, you really know what it means and how it works. So don't feel like you don't have the knowledge or skill to perform certain tasks, because you really, when you get involved, you learn it in about a week or something. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and just adding on to Omar and Kyle, in my case, Professor Burton knew that I had a really limited experience in CS, but he sent me an email with literally like 25 different videos that I could check out from like tutorials that had been presented in his group, and he just ended up recording them. So I just spent like a few weeks going through those. So like, I know Omar mentioned that he just went on YouTube, but sometimes it might be the professor who's sending you YouTube links as well. So they definitely understand that, especially the first year, like there's a lot of catching up to do, and they'll definitely support that as well.
Any other final questions? Or any of the panelists to each other? I know we have an age range here too, an experience range. Otherwise, I just want to reiterate how grateful we are to the panelists for their presentations and answering of these questions. Kyle, I don't know if you have any other send-off words, but thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Carrie. That was a good, very good culmination for the panel. And here I just want to say thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you all the panelists and presenters for giving such a great presentation and all your great advice for all the attendees. Thank you very much.